Well, good morning if you are in Alaska, where I know I have listeners. Good afternoon if you are in New York City, from where I am speaking. Good evening in Dresden, in Germany, where my guest is. And greetings to people all around the world in this holiday season where we are trying to find love and peace and use those as replacements for war and aggression. Music is one way of doing that, and we have music on Adagio. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. My guest today is someone I've met a couple of times. We've had a couple of good meals together. We share many interests. We love herring, among other things, and that makes us special. If you love herring, raise your hands back out to you in the world. And his name is Jan Vogler. Jan Vogler is one of the world's leading and most soulful cellists. I can add that adjective. And he's also the artistic director of the Dresdner Music Festival. And we're going to talk about the cello, and we're going to talk about the Dresdner Music Festival. And Jan, you're in Dresden, yes?
Yes, I'm in Dresden right now and will be in New York later in the month.
Later. Very good. I look forward to seeing you in person. Perhaps we'll get together, go on a herring run.
Yes.
So I want to start by asking you a couple of things about yourself for people who may not know you or have only heard you play but not speak. Talk about where you were born and how you first came to know the cello and the cello came to know you.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure, Fred, to be on this podcast and to talk about things, music and other things. And how I was raised and where I was born is actually now sounds quite exotic. So because I was born in East Berlin in the middle of the GDR era, so in the communist East Germany, and my parents, quite unusual, both musicians, were very much cosmopolitans in a very small environment. So East Germany was not the place for people who think globally and who, have big visions, because it was a country completely isolated. We couldn't travel to the West. The border was closed. And only my mom and my dad, because they were playing in orchestras in East Berlin, they could sometimes travel. And perhaps that made them immediately open their mind to the whole world and all the interesting things there are. And so I had the luck in that environment to grow up in an incredibly imaginable family with, art and lots of books. And my father had 1,000 hobbies and was interested in about everything from Greek tragedies to modern American literature or music recordings from all over the world, recordings by immigrants who lived in America and recordings by artists who lived in West Germany or in France. So we were very lucky in this East Berlin atmosphere of the 1970s growing up. And my brother learned the violin, and my dad gave me a cello because he said, you're the second child, your brother got the violin, try the cello. And I have to say it was love at first sight. I think something physical about playing the cello interested me right away, and also something worked. So I guess I developed pride pretty soon that something is working. Not everything was working. I had to practice like every other kid, and they had tears and other things. But in the musician's family, to be so lucky to start playing the cello and being happy with it and kind of striking the luck to find your instrument right away where you can express yourself was a very happy thing. So I can only talk very positively about my childhood in that East Germany of the 1970s. It was a culturally rich childhood, and of course lots of love. And we are going to talk about love a few times today, I think.
Yeah. I do want to ask you a couple of things about East Berlin in that time. Number one, what instruments did your parents play?
My mother played the violin and my dad played the cello.
Okay. Was he your first teacher?
No, he sent me to a lady, we called her Mrs. Jordan, and she was teaching all the musicians' children who who were aspiring to be cellists. And she was extremely patient. And she was a single lady, older lady, always dressed immaculately and with patience like a saint. So I think she was really the person who helped me first. But my dad always had an ear out, I would say, at home. And the level was clear. It was clear that if I would, at some point decide to be a cellist, that only the highest quality would be allowed to
Yeah.
pursue this goal, because musicians families, that's what you get some advantage, that people know about it, and the disadvantage is the pressure. You're going to end up with a lot of pressure because your parents know the game and they're going to tell you how difficult it is, and there's no idealism. There's mostly a practical approach about hard work, and that you just got to cut through your own you know defaults and succeed and rise above all the difficulties that you might see or feel.
So in April of 1979, I was a student. I lived in Italy for much of the 1970s, and I was a student that year working at La Scala. And there was a conference that was held in West Berlin in April of 1979. And I was chosen from Italy to go represent part of the United States in the conference in West Berlin. And at that time, I made a friend who is still a very close friend of mine. His name is Mark Anderson. And Mark was a Fulbright in Germany. I had a Fulbright in Italy. And Mark was in Saarbrücken. So I was going from Milan to Berlin. There was some correspondence. But Saarbrücken to Berlin was really quite many steps up. And we became quick friends because he came from a musical family. His uncle was an opera singer. And we went to 3 operas together. We went to Parsifal and Le Nozze di Figaro in West Berlin on the Kudamm. I believe it's on the Kudamm in the Deutsche Oper West Berlin. And then we went to an opera in East Berlin. And I genuinely don't recall if it was in the Komische or what we now call Unter den Linden. I think it was the Komische. And
Probably.
it was Tosca. And what was very particular about that production of Tosca was that when she jumped off the parapet at the end of the opera, she jumped off the Berlin Wall into the Spree River.
Oh, wow.
And it really shocked me and Mark because the productions in West Berlin, the Nozze di Figaro was very conventional. It was my first Parsifal, and all they had was a green light bulb, and whoever sang stood under the light bulb and then stepped out of the light bulb. I was not ready for that. Now I love Parsifal, but at the time I didn't understand anything. But that Tosca in East Berlin with singers I did not know was so riveting because of the sense of commitment. And when she jumped off the Berlin Wall, the cheering that came from the audience was really quite something. And it remains one of my most memorable opera experiences. I was able, and Mark was able, to take the underground, the subway, back and forth between East and West. And I remember walking around the East and how different it was from the West because it was darker. The West
Yes.
was incredibly lit up with all kinds of lighting. It looked like Times Square in New York City. And
Right.
it was such an interesting difference because the energy of the West was very different from the seriousness of the East. I'm not saying they were not serious in the West, but my friend Mark, who went on to head the German department at Columbia University, would go to the East to buy books. And you were talking about books being available. Mark basically bought all the classics of German literature in East Berlin at a very, very cheap price. And they remain central to his library to this day. And I guess what I've always wondered about people, and I've known many, who've lived in communist societies in the 60s and 70s, who had access to certain things and not other things. I imagine you had access to most German literature. Was there any kind of book that you did not have access to?
Well, here comes the trick. My dad was teaching some people in West Berlin, from West Berlin. They
Ah,
would take the same subway you and your friend took to come to East Berlin to take cello lessons with my dad.
ah,
And in exchange, they would bring all the books and magazines that were not available in East Berlin. So we were very lucky because we had, like, there's a German music journal. Actually, it just closed its doors, Phonoforum, which was basically a classical magazine where you could read about all the newest recordings, and it was very, very interesting for us as a musical family. The friends of my father also brought a couple of Playboys and and some books by people like Solzhenitsyn, who was forbidden in East Germany, and some authors also which were not available. For example, books by Henry Miller or Arthur Miller from the United States. Those books were not available in East Berlin. So we were quite lucky to have a quite complete collection. Books by Heinrich Böll, the famous West German author, not available in East Berlin. So I guess anything that was politically a little bit against the Communist Party was hard to get or not available in the country. But then sometimes, like your opera experience, there were some funny details. So like the Komische Oper especially had often political jokes at the leading party, hidden or not so hidden, and it went through. And we would go to the opera, and it was quite exciting to read between the lines sometimes, some criticism with the party, which on the outside didn't allow any criticism, any regime basically. And there was still very subtle jokes, and it was very interesting, and arts were blooming. And I do think also about Russia at that time during the Cold War and very dark times. Stalin, Shostakovich, that's a little earlier, but still Brezhnev was the guy when when I was growing up, was the president in the Soviet Union. And similarly in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, or back then Leningrad, fantastic musicians grew up, from David Oistrakh to Mstislav Rostropovich and Shostakovich. And in a time when nothing of that was supported by the government, it was basically, I think, the spirit of the art is something that is so strong that even suppression can sometimes, do the opposite and make it flourish even more. So
it
I guess the
intensifies
arts,
it.
yeah. So there's some philosophical aspect of this, which I believe very much. That's why I guess I learned to believe in the arts very much, no matter in what times we live, whether there's peace or difficult times, war, or times when it seems that humanity is taking a turn to the south and is losing its core values. At the same time, arts never really disappear or vanish, and they always play this important role, because I think they remind us of what people before us have gone through. And that's something that I guess I learned already during my childhood, and which still I believe very strongly in today.
I had my first opportunity to go to the Soviet Union that same year in 1979 in July and August. And
Wow.
because Moscow was preparing to have the 1980 Olympics, I couldn't get to Moscow except for one day where we drove past Red Square. And therefore, most of my time was assigned to Leningrad and the Baltic republics. And
Wow.
I met a lot of people in the arts and had my first opportunity to go to what was then called the Kirov, now the Mariinsky, in Leningrad, St. Petersburg. And I have family origins there. My father's father came from there. And therefore, it really felt like home to me. And I found the people of Leningrad, St. Petersburg, intensely cultured.
Intensely.
They
True.
were, I mean, yes, Berlin, yes, New York, London, Paris, Milan, places like that, Vienna, but there was a passion about the arts, all the arts, that was not just, the Soviet art, but they were very proud of the collection in the museum in St. Petersburg, whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, but one of the great museums of the world.
Hermitage, the Hermitage.
Hermitage, thank you.
Yeah.
And you'd go into the Hermitage and you'd see these magnificent treasures by Rembrandt, especially, but sculptures by Michelangelo. They gathered everything. And then you would go to the theaters and the best Shakespeare Othello I've ever seen was in St. Peter in Leningrad by far.
Right,
And I don't speak Russian, but the
right.
acting, the passion, the connection to the emotions. The Russians have big emotions anyway, I can say as a part Russian, but they experience them in the theater and in ballet and in everything, not because they were claiming to be the best, but this was their refuge at a time when they often didn't have food, when they were afraid to communicate. Um, I came to know people there who I later helped come to the West. They were musicians, but everything was intense, and everything was intense in Berlin when I was there.
Yes.
And while I would not wish that on anyone, what I do miss was the fullness of the humanity that was not, I hate to say this, but you'll know what I mean, was not corrupted by commercialism. There was a purity about the art there because that's what they had. And I would never want them to have to endure what they were enduring then, and certainly not in World War II with the 900 days and the siege and all that. But I will never, there are times and places I've been where I just felt that the audience was receiving a message that went well beyond what the composer, the librettist, the playwright intended. I've had that in Barcelona when Catalonia was separatist. I've had that in Italy at certain political times. I've had it in Ireland when Ireland and England were at odds. I've had it in New York City many times with different political issues, and we have this in our streets in New York City. And I certainly have experienced in Berlin and Vienna many times. Um, Not in Switzerland somehow, which is not to say that the art is not good, but it was missing that edge. I mean, I've seen wonderful ring cycles and everything in Switzerland, and I've worked in the Verbier Festival a couple of times, but it's not the same. It leads me in a way, unless there's something you want to reply to on that, to ask you about the Dresden Music Festival, because Dresden is one of the world's cultural capitals. It is in the former East Germany, in Saxony, along with Leipzig, although Dresden's the capital. And I did not get to Dresden until post-communism. So therefore, I didn't know it before. When you were a boy in Berlin, East Berlin, did you travel to other cultural capitals of Eastern Germany?
Yeah, and I did. And also to Dresden. I came as a child to Dresden because the Dresdner Musikfestival, the same Dresdner Music Festival, would present concerts that you couldn't hear in East Berlin. Because I think the communist government was clever to assign the essence of, let's say, great music, great art, rather to Dresden, and let's say the representative power to build to East Berlin. So Dresden was a city that had already fabulous museums, the Swinger Museum, the Old
Yeah.
Master Gallery, and it had the Staatskapelle in Dresden. And way before I actually moved to Dresden at the age of 20, I visited Dresden for concerts of the Dresdner Musikfestspiele, the Dresdner Music Festival, because they had these fabulous people. They had like the New York Philharmonic, or they had the Berlin Philharmonic with Karajan, or just things that, or the 12 cellos of the Berlin Philharmonic. So I knew that there was a special love for music in Dresden. And when I was basically thinking about my career at the age of 20, I auditioned for the principal cellist job, or how it was called here, a bit more fancy, concertmaster cello. That I auditioned for that job, and everybody told me, including my dad, said, "Oh, you will never get that job, and if you get it, you won't survive the first year." Because first of all, he knew how prestigious this orchestra was, and then second of all, he knew that they would expect the principal cellist to know everything. And I was 20 and I could play the cello pretty well, but I didn't know anything about opera and big symphonies. But they had very demanding conductors, for recordings. They had people like Carlos Kleiber or Herbert von Karajan. So when I finally moved to Dresden, I did get the job against all odds, and I did survive the first year. despite the fact that 3 of my assistant principals were all working for the Secret Service, for the Stasi.
Uh-huh.
So I only figured that out later in 1989 when they were fired, because the wall came down and there was the screening for, who worked for the Secret Service, and whoever did was gone. And I was really surprised that all 3 of them were working for the Secret Service. So I was actually in an odd place, but this love for music, I will tell you a little story, and this really demonstrates how much they loved the music in Dresden back then already. So I had my first opera performance, and before I had a recording session at the recording studio, and I put the music of the opera by Lortzing called Czar and Zimmerman. I put it on my car, and it was my first year of driving. And I put it on the roof of my car, put my cello in the car, and started driving. And the score, which belonged to the Staatsoper, and was a historic score of the, I guess, the premiere of this piece in Dresden, so it was probably 100 years or more, older than 100 years, flew probably on the intersection somewhere through the air. And it wasn't more than an hour that somebody came to the receptionist of the opera house and said, oh, somebody must have lost this very important part. And we saw on your Spielplan that tonight you're playing that opera. You need that part. So somebody was not only bringing back the part, he or she had understood that the piece was on that night, and that probably the cellist who lost it really needs it. So I think that story demonstrates that how high art was in the hierarchy of things in Dresden back then. And so I got lucky. I lived about roughly a decade with that job, and before I moved on to my solo career. And I owe Dresden a lot of experience in music, deep experience in music, by playing all these operas and symphonies. And I think this has shaped my solo career also, because this reservoir of music that I've gone through has definitely given me a better kind of, I would say, base knowledge about what music of these composers is about. Which, if you play just the cello sonata or just the Dvorak concerto or just the Brahms cello sonata, you can't quite see the full picture, in my opinion.
So I must ask, the 3 Stasi cellists, were they good cellists?
Yeah, at least two of them were very good. and I think the interesting part was that, of course, I felt they had certain confidence, and I had my own confidence. My confidence came just from the fact that I think I did realize I was, in terms of pure cello playing, I was ahead of the section and I could lead them. But then they had this confidence about knowledge within, how does an opera work, and when do you have to be careful? It's almost like you're in a paddle boat and on a river, and there's some part coming where there's a waterfall, and then there's a little bit quieter waters, and then there's suddenly something where you have to watch out not to hit the rock on the right side. And so this kind of game, which in my opinion is a bit like driving, everybody learns it in an orchestra, but the members who are in the orchestra, of course, they have take pride in knowing the river very well, and where to be careful, where to strap yourself for real, and where you can relax a little bit. So, of course, I had no clue about these things. And I guess for me, the pressure to learn to be a leader early on under, I would say, hard circumstances was very good for me, because I still treasure the fact that I learned early on how a leader has to more listen than actually talk, and how a leader has to understand his team before he can lead the team. So I guess for me it was all lucky, and of course it could have gone pretty wrong under different circumstances, but it did go very well, and I soon earned the respect of the orchestra and played solo with them. And Giuseppe Sinopoli, who was the last chief conductor under the time when I was in the orchestra, wonderful conductor. You probably have met him and heard his performance.
I worked with him.
Yeah,
on Tosca at the Met in 1985.
Exactly. Yeah. So he was a very, very smart and educated man, knew everything from Adorno or to Greek mythology. And so he was someone who then took me on tour as the soloist and gave me a kickoff into my solo career. So I own the Staatskapelle at the time there a lot.
No, so I'm trying to remember about Sinopoli. He was from Venice, and I forget whether his major in college was psychology or philosophy. It was one of the two,
Psychology.
and
Psychology.
psychology.
Yeah.
And having a conversation with him in Italian, which I did, was like talking German in Italian. He had a
Yes.
German mind in an
Yeah.
Italian body. And
Correct. Correct. Yeah.
he was, I always found it very interesting that he, and not just he, Fabio Luisi, there are certain Italian conductors who find the German speaking countries very congenial culturally. I mean, I love them
Yeah.
culturally. What I mean is, I'm an American and I'm open to a lot of different cultures. But if you grow up in one of the dominant European cultures, if you adopt another one as your primary one, that's really a step into a different world than my open Americanness that will take me wherever I go. But he was, if I remember, he died conducting Aida, and he was in Berlin
Yes.
in the orchestra pit. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Correct. And his wife and children were in the audience. It was a
terrible.
violent death, and he was
Yeah,
only 53, I believe. And
yeah.
he was a wonderful man. And you're totally right. The fascination with the Italian conductors, with Vienna and German culture, goes really from Abbado through Sinopoli to Fabio Luisi, who also studied in Vienna, has even a slight Viennese accent in his German.
Yes, I
So
know.
Fabio, I work with a lot. So we play together. Often we are friends. And past 20 years, I had the pleasure to work with him with the Dallas Symphony or with other orchestras. And we have performed Don Quixote by Strauss a lot, and Haydn Concerto and Dvorak Concerto. And I'm looking forward to playing again with him. Actually, at the Dresden Music Festival next year with the NHK Symphony Orchestra.
We're going to get to that in a moment, but it's interesting how my next topic connects to what we're talking about with Fabio Luisi. The last time I sat down with him, we had dinner, was February 2nd of 2020. I remember the date because the pandemic had already hit China and Italy. And he was not in Italy, he was in Dallas. And they did a concert, wonderful concert performance at the Dallas Symphony of Salome. And as you know, in America, we have something called the Super Bowl, which is the big football match of the year. It was that Sunday.
Wow.
And we had a decent sized audience, given that it was Super Bowl Sunday, because the Super Bowl was at night. But the problem was finding a meal in the evening, because Dallas was not playing, but all of Dallas shut down to watch the football game.
Yes.
But it meant that we could sit down and really talk about things for a while. And he's a fascinating man, Fabio Luisi, just a wonderful conductor. But what it leads me to was my next question about Salome, and not only. I work in opera. Richard Strauss wrote 12 operas, 9 of which had their premieres in Dresden. And given that he was from outside of Munich and he worked a fair amount in Munich and Vienna and conducted in New York a bit, but how come and what is the relationship now between the music and the art of Richard Strauss and Dresden?
Well, I think it's really interesting because Dresden has that lucky history that from the 19th century throughout the 20th century, many composers premiered their works in Dresden, from Carl Maria von Weber, who is, of course, an incredible composer. Mainly now we know his Freischütz, but there are other operas and other works of him. I consider him one of the greatest masters of the 19th century, and also one of the greatest ambassadors of the Romantic era and feeling. And then Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner was music director.
We're going to get to Wagner later. He gets his own story.
Okay, I'm not touching it, but I'm just saying, because I think Richard Strauss comes out of that story. Richard Strauss was very ambitious when he was a young man in Berlin. He was at every party, very good looking and extremely confident young man. And I think he wanted to premiere operas, but Munich was way too conservative. So he got very lucky that he could premiere his operas in Dresden. And I read a lot. I read actually some books with letters written by him to the opera house in Dresden, complaining about that they played too few of his operas in the repertoire performances. He was a very good businessman as well. And I think this relationship of Richard Strauss and Dresden is just a symbol, like how Dresden was clever in sometimes just taking the lead in something and taking the lead and saying, look, yes, we do it. We feel that's a good idea. Let's do it. It's still there. I still feel we do projects here sometimes now where others are maybe slightly arrogant or think, oh, maybe not yet. Maybe this composer is too young to premiere a whole symphony or a big work. And we say, hey, come to Dresden, let's do it. And I often think about this time when Strauss got the opportunity to premiere all these operas in Dresden, and I feel like let's not kill that spirit. It's a very important, spirit to believe in young people, believe in very gifted young people, and giving them a outrageously big chance. Because Salome was a scandal, as we
Yeah.
all know, and it's still a
Um,
scandal if you hear this scandalous music. And the great thing about it is it's in a way in a time now when nothing is a scandal. Everything is possible, and we can see everything on the internet from A to Z. And then we listen to a Salome, and it still sounds absolutely scandalous from the first to the last note.
I wonder if you went to an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London about 10 years ago that I had some input on, in which it was about opera, but rather than covering all of opera, they addressed 7 operas that had their premieres in 7 cities. So it was as much about the city as the opera. So I'm remembering Nabucco for Verdi for Milan. I'm remembering Shostakovich, Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk for St. Petersburg or Leningrad. I am remembering Venice, but I'm forgetting whether it was Handel's Rinaldo. I think it was Handel's Rinaldo. And Paris, Tannhäuser, and Dresden for Salome was among the ones. And it was about how the cities related to those particular operas and were changed by those operas. Mozart, Le Nozze di Figaro, Vienna was the other one. And I always find it interesting when I'm visiting Dresden. I've had the good fortune to visit a fair amount, to walk around the streets and be aware of all those people who were there. We're really Wagner out for now. But the degree that Strauss was there, I believe that Weber is buried somewhere, I forget the direction, but it's toward Pirna, in the neighborhood where a young man named Vladimir Putin lived and learned his German.
Correct.
And, so when he dealt with Angela Merkel, who was from East Germany, they knew each other's German in a way. And I always find that very interesting. But Dresden severely bombed during World War II, beautifully rebuilt, maintains its natural beauty of the Elbe River. The other side, let's say the quieter side, is idyllic with vineyards, and there's a little milk bar that I love on that side of the river. There's a lot to love and discover in Dresden, but what I'm wondering about is the following. There are many cities that have relationships with composers who are long dead, but the composers remain. So Mozart, Salzburg especially, Verdi, Milan, other cities too, but especially Milan, Leonard Bernstein, New York City, but also Gustav Mahler, New York City. And when you go to the Philharmonic and their archives, you find the scores that he worked on with his markings that maybe Bernstein and others, Bruno Walter, went and marked on further, but nonetheless, you can discover that. And I wonder whether musically, the DNA of Richard Strauss, not to mention Wagner for now, but Richard Strauss exists in the musicians today because they would learn from the musicians of the past. And is there a special way of playing or understanding Richard Strauss among musicians in Dresden?
Definitely. I mean, if you hear the Staatskapelle play Richard Strauss, you really hear a very natural way to play this music. I mean, there are very many virtuosic orchestras around the world who can play a fantastic Ein Heldenleben, fantastic Salome. Even we had the Cleveland Orchestra here a couple of years ago at the Dresdner Musikfestspiele, the Dresden Music Festival, and they played the Rosenkavalier suite with a Vorspiel for the third act. And I never heard all the notes in that piece. And I think Strauss himself said, it's not possible. Just don't think about the notes. They're not all supposed to be played. The Cleveland Orchestra definitely played all the notes. And it was under Franz Welser Möst, if I remember correctly, it was a fabulous performance. But there's something very natural about Strauss being played in Dresden by the Staatskapelle. I noticed it when I played in the orchestra. I noticed it when I played Don Quixote with them. I recorded it with them. It's on Adagio, I believe, and also did perform it very often with the Staatskapelle and Fabio Risi on tour or in Dresden on America tour also. I just hear the Strauss in a very natural way. They just have the confidence, as you said, from their ancestors, and from player to player, it was transmitted, and they have this confidence of that they kind of have the feeling how that goes. And they had the fortune, of course, of having Karl Böhm, Carlos Kleiber, Karajan in the meantime, who came for recordings, Bernhard Haitink for Rosenkavalier, who always nurtured that understanding. And at the same time, I think, let's be realistic, I think Strauss is not very popular these days. I think it comes from Richard Strauss' music is, of course, a nostalgic music. And we feel that it doesn't necessarily get played quite as much as 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It's perhaps going to come back, but it might be that his music was late to music history. If we really think, without any arrogancy, but if we think about it, that Shostakovich was always very acute. It was music that expressed, the avant-garde in the 1930s. It expressed the patriotism in the Leningrad Symphony during the war, and it expressed the suffocating atmosphere of the Cold War. And then Richard Strauss' music was always a little too pleasant for its time, except maybe the early works like Elektra, Salome, Don Quixote. They're very edgy works that are from a young man.
I find Elektra very pleasant.
Yeah, Elektra. I love Elektra, but Elektra is an extreme. It's an extreme piece. It has extreme emotions. But if we think Rosenkavalier, so I wonder why. But I have to say that in the meantime, Wagner's music, or music that's written before Strauss, exceeds perhaps the popularity now. It could have to do that Strauss kind of sometimes, again, without any arrogancy, chickened out from history. He didn't really acknowledge history, except when he came to Dresden after the war. He saw the destroyed city. He wrote the Metamorphosis, a beautiful work, absolutely stunning.
I think his greatest piece outside of the operas.
Yeah, his greatest
than any of the tone poems. I love that piece.
Yeah, it was really out of the sadness. He saw his Dresden, where he premiered all these operas, he saw it destroyed in rubble after the war, and then wrote Metamorphosis. I think that's a piece that's very, very touching. But I sometimes have to say, in comparison with other composers, maybe we have to think that we have to live in our time, and we have to, be interested in what's special about our time as artists, and somehow have to find a connection to our time if we want to really express history, I guess. It's a question. I mean, I have no answer, but I have lots of questions.
Now, since you mentioned Rosenkavalier, and since you mentioned Richard Strauss having been a very good businessman and card player, he spent a lot of his time playing cards. I happened to read a number of years ago a correspondence that the young-ish Richard Strauss had with the very old Giuseppe Verdi. And it was specifically about money. It was about, I believe Strauss set up what in America is called ASCAP, the union of composers, to make sure that composers got paid for their work. And Verdi always made sure that he got paid for his work. So they had a very cordial and interesting correspondence about finances as a composer. But then Strauss allowed that he was very taken with Verdi's character of Falstaff, and how interesting Falstaff was, and how pleasing, and how unlike everything else that Verdi composed, great though Verdi is. But Falstaff was the thing apart that he wrote as a very old man. So I have this theory that Baron Ochs in Der Rosenkavalier is Richard Strauss's Falstaff.
Yeah, Very true. I think fair
So
enough.
when I work with singers who are playing baroques, I
Yeah,
suggest to them they study Falstaff, and
yeah,
then
I
they'll
think
understand too. They don't get the coarseness that sometimes you see in a baroque, who's just a little too over the top. But
absolutely,
the pleasure-seeking part, the wine,
definitely.
the slivovitz, and all of that,
Yeah,
that makes him lustig, as they say in
yeah,
German.
yes.
So there's that. And now I would love one more cello question. You play an Italian cello from 1707, a Stradivari, and talk about your cello, talk about what it feels like in your arms and what it sounds like in your ear and what it feels to play with the bow and everything.
Well, the cello, I had an interest also early on. My father was not only a cellist, he also did some violin making. And so did my brother. My brother built his first violin at age 14, although he was a concertmaster also later. And so I had interest early on. And in my childhood in East Germany, you have to imagine an East German boy wandering the streets of East Berlin, thinking the biggest dream of his life would be to once play a Stradivarius cello. Clearly, right? I was probably not the only one. And then the wall coming down, I started, right after the wall to buy my first cello, a real valuable cello. And now about the past 12 years, I had the fortune to play on this fantastic Stradivarius instrument from his golden period. Stradivarius invented the modern cello. He was a conservative man like Bach. They lived at the same time, but when they went for something modern, they just mastered it. Bach,
Mm-hmm.
as well as Stradivarius, and Stradivarius watched other makers trying to make smaller cellos for soloists, which were just starting. Cello as a solo instrument just started to appear in Venice and Italy around 1700. And Stradivarius before built big cellos as bass instruments in church. And he, I guess, was very skeptical that the cello could be a solo instrument. But around 1707, he started building these smaller cellos. Not small, not big, just perfect. And mine was one of the first ones. He built altogether 20 cellos on that format in the golden period and called the Form B, or in Italian Forma B. So that was his contribution to inventing the modern cello, basically. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm very lucky to have that cello. And as a partner, I would say it is so perfect that it shows me all my flaws. So when I practice, it's really pretty much if I can make my cello happy and can make it sound on every note the way its potential, tells me, then I think I'm a lucky man. So basically, the work is very much determined by this dialogue between this cello and myself, and I'm very lucky also to have a very good bow. The great bows were made in the 19th century, mostly by FX Tourt, Frank Xavier Tourt, or also Dominique Picat. And those makers, they understood very much how to match those great instruments, which were traded in France around this time, the first half of the 19th century in Paris and in France. So it was no coincidence that these great Italian instruments met with those French bows. So those tools, yeah. Heifetz once said when somebody came after a concert to him and said, "Oh, your violin sounds wonderful." He shook it in the air and said, "I don't hear anything." He was a confident man, and I guess he wanted to express that the violin itself can sound by itself. But I cannot produce such a sound without my cello, and the cello cannot produce such sound without me. So I think we are a good couple.
You're a couple, yes.
We have a dialogue, and I have a family in New York. I have two wonderful kids and a wonderful wife. But I have to say, I think we are probably a family of five because the cello is definitely part of the family, and I think it's for me, it's somewhat alive and somewhat responding to me, just like my other family members.
On certain social media groups that I'm a part of, I'm mostly with opera groups, but I do follow instrumentalists. One of the most consistent discussions is about air travel and musical instruments.
Oh yeah,
And
nightmare, common nightmare.
cellists seem to have a particular issue because sometimes they're asked to either put it in the overhead bin, which is insane, or underneath the plane, which is insane. How do you and your cello travel,
Well,
given
we
that you
travel
family?
next to each other. I buy a
Yeah.
seat for it, and um, it's whatever class we travel. The good part is I don't have a neighbor who talks to me or takes up more space than needed. So my lucky part is it's actually quite relaxing to have the cello next to you and sit there, and it's quite a routine, I would say. But as you might know, I once met a new friend on a plane. His name is Bill Murray. He's an actor, famous
Yeah.
actor in America, and we became friends just because talking about the cello. The cello was sitting on the window seat. I was sitting on the aisle, and Bill was sitting across the aisle, and he was like, "Really, the cello getting the window seat?" He was slightly scandalized, and it was a transatlantic flight from Berlin, from the old Tegel airport to New York City, and so we had lots of time to talk. And I watched one of his films on the plane and talking, and we became friends. And later started touring together. So actually, things can happen on trips in airplanes, and the cello is always a talking point because the cello in the seat. I think many people freak out and think like, well, that's luxurious.
But also, I would put the cello in the window seat because it doesn't need the bathroom.
Right, exactly.
um, so actually, I do have one more cello question. I would have a million, but you were talking about playing in the orchestra in Dresden and playing operas. Did you ever play Don Carlo
No, I never played on Carlo.
with the famous cello
Cello
solo
solo,
alla
yeah.
Jemima Mo?
Right. No, I didn't. I
So
didn't think
if you're doing
Oscar and others, yeah, other cello solos
if you're
for.
doing an encore, maybe this is programmed already and I didn't see it in the program, but if you're doing an encore this year at the Dresden Music Festival where the theme is love, find yourself a bass. They're around. Renee Papa lives in Dresden. Maybe he's around. Um,
Right.
and it's 9 minutes of aria, including a lot of cello. It's cello. It's basically cello and bass singer.
You're right. Yes, I
Ella
know the
Jemima
area
Mo. It's one
aria.
of the greatest scenes in all of opera.
Yeah.
And do that as an encore, or just have a surprise love fest where this
Great
is the
idea.
opposite. It's about the absence of love. But
Great
it
idea.
so there
Yeah.
you go. That's it on that.
Great.
Now let's talk about the festival itself. You said it's 48 years old, or it's having its 48th season, um, and therefore existed in the time of the communist era, the post-communist era, the current era, whatever we define it as, and because initially it was a festival in the communist era, have the audiences changed? Was it a more local audience at first and now a more international audience?
I think so. I mean, Dresden basically exploded in um, attractivity. I mean, the attractivity of Dresden exploded kind of after the Frauenkirche was rebuilt. I myself was lucky to play at the opening with Lauren Mazel and the New York Philharmonic, the Schumann Concerto. And I realized back then that when the Frauenkirche was opened, there was somewhat Dresden more complete. Then later, the Kulturpalast reopened. It was rebuilt. It's a fantastic modern concert hall now, all in this triangle between Semper Oper, which opened in 85, so pretty early during communist times. Frauenkirche opened in 2005, and then later, 2016, I believe, the Kulturpalast opened, or 17. So we now have these amazing concert halls, all in walking distance. It's all like 5 minutes from each other or less. So I think for tourists, it's highly attractive. They stay in a hotel somewhere in that Bermuda Triangle in
Yeah.
one of the hotels. And then they go to the museums during daytime. At night, they go to either the Kulturpalast, the Frauenkirche, or Semper, or whatever we present, or wherever we present. And we do present the same artists they can hear in Paris, Lucerne, Salzburg, or New York City. And so we try to present the highest quality of classical music and beyond classical music, in fact. So I think has become much more a travel destination, and I think the mayor is happy with the festival because we do attract a lot of cultural tourists, and the hotels are packed. I mean, if you come in May, you better book early because May, June, the hotels are full and the people are just flooding the city. The cultural lovers or cultural lovers from all over the world.
And there's one more thing about May and June in Dresden, and not only white asparagus.
Correct. White asparagus, not herring, but white asparagus.
Not herring, but I mean, herring comes in June.
Herring comes in June, but the white asparagus are great. You eat them with a little ham or with a schnitzel, or just vegetarian purists eat them just with potatoes. So,
or I have them with butter and cheese.
Yeah, why not? I mean, the democracy.
But really, people listening, if you've never had white asparagus, there are a few places in the world, but basically Germany, parts of Austria, and northeastern Italy, around Verona. There's a town called Cavaillon, which is very famous for the white asparagus. Also Bassano del Grappa, where Tito Gobi was from, and all of Friuli, Venezia Giulia. So that is yet another reason to go.
Yeah.
Now, I meant to mention one thing to you. I said Verona. I wonder whether you have done the following trip, and if you've not, I commend it to you. When one travels south from Germany to Austria and into Italy, there's the Brenner Pass, and you enter in what's called Südtirol or Alto Adige, and then you enter the Trentino, and there are two big cities. There's Trento and there's Rovereto. If you travel west from either Trento or Rovereto, that's the forest where Stradivarius got his wood for his instruments.
All right.
Have you ever been in that forest?
Yes. And it's not that deep anymore as it was at Stradivarius times. There were more trees, but it's still very, very, I mean, for this wood, it needs to grow very slowly, and the year rings need to be as even as possible. Those trees would have been in the middle of the forest where the weather can't get to them. So it's not anymore the same deep forest, obviously, because it's a much more populated region now, but you still see the remaining parts of that forest, and it's very touching. Yeah.
And something just popped in my head. What kind of wood is it?
It's pine, of course, for the top. So it's mostly pine. And the maple for the back, that's a different region. But I think that region is mostly the pine that he used.
The reason I ask is because the second largest town is called Rovereto. Rovere in Italian is oak.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, but I guess it's not oak.
No, not oak. No, too hard for instruments. For tables.
Now back to Dresden and focusing on this year's festival, which is going to be from the 17th of May to the 14th of June, so almost a month. Did you, as artistic director, every year have a theme, a motto, or was this coming season in 2025 particular in picking a motto?
We always had a theme. It was actually a thing invented way before I took over 15 years ago. So I liked the tradition. I thought, let's embrace it. But I shifted a little bit from purely musical themes to themes that could inspire society, communities. And at the moment, I think the theme love this year is actually an answer. It's not a question, it's an answer to what do we think about the current times. And I think Michael Jackson a little bit. Sorry to go to the pop music, but Michael Jackson was this guy who would just appear and just say a couple of words, and usually was love and peace or something like this. And he would actually, in the last film, it's called That's It, there's a scene where he comes for the rehearsal with the tour, and you see all these fabulous artists training, and you think, oh my God, they're all the best dancers, the best singers. And then he comes and makes a couple of steps and says, love. And then everybody explodes in art and in creativity and everything. So I do think that love is not only a very important inspiration for art, it is also an answer to our current time. I do find that there is a lot of cold, I would not say, but I think reservations, people have their reservations. They don't really open their hearts so easily. There's hate, even much worse. And I think love is really an answer to the question, what is most important if we think about our fellow humans? I think let's embrace love more again. It's maybe a little bit a cry out for pop art, for the time of the time of pop art when love was a common, I think, nominator after the times, where people had lots of fight for freedom and for all kinds of freedom. And I think now we are again at a crossroad, I feel, where we have to, no matter what comes, no matter what government leads, no matter what times we go through and what we believe in, whether we are a Democrat or a Republican, or whether we are in Germany, very much on the super modern side or more conservative. Let's just remember how important love is, and let's find it in music, and let's communicate it through music. This was the idea behind the theme.
The way you would surprise some people quoting Michael Jackson, I think I would shock a lot of people in quoting Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, why not?
But he wrote a musical that's not as well known as some of the others, but I liked it more, called Aspects of Love.
Yes.
And what it explored in a non-cat way, non-Phantom of the Opera kind of way, but in something a lot more human, was aspects of love, and how that word can encompass so many things. When I teach opera to the public and I have them look at a libretto in Italian, French, German, Russian, or English, just to take the top languages, or Czech, and we have the word love, I always say, now, mind you, there is romantic love, there is filial love of a child to a parent, there's parental love, there is neighborly love, there is erotic love, there is love of country, there is love of religion, there is love for thy neighbor, there is love for animals, there's love for nature. And I think that sometimes we forget that, or we belittle that.
Yes.
And I've known people who genuinely lead with love, is how they would describe it. I would like to think that I lead with love. I try to lead with love. I'm very affectionate. But that sometimes is misunderstood, because people take that as I'm being too forward or inappropriate, when in fact I'm just being a lot more open in my feelings. And I think with love often can come gratitude. And if you we recently had Thanksgiving here in America, and for us, if we take that holiday seriously, there are no gifts that one gives. It's not a commercial holiday, but it's about assessment and reevaluation. And if you find it within yourself to show love, to experience love, which is frankly sometimes harder than showing love, if you can find in music the intangible, where love may not be expressed in words, although songs and operas can do that, but you can take any Mozart piano concerto, you can take many cello concertos that speak love, even once it may not seem to, like the Elgar, in my opinion, would not seem like it does, but it absolutely does. If you can connect to that, I always believe that in teaching music, I tell people not to analyze, but to open all their pores, all their senses, and allow it to come in. That is where love is best expressed, of the kind that doesn't have an adjective with it. So
Yes.
paternal, filial, etc. Just love.
Right. I think it's limitless. It's completely limitless. And if we understand it's limitless, we can perhaps learn something from music. Because if we go to a concert of any kind, doesn't even have to be a love-inspired piece. Of course, in our program, there are literally hundreds of pieces that were inspired by love. And almost every composer has written something that's extremely inspired by love. Wagner was one of those composers. Richard Wagner couldn't really live without any partner. I mean, he always had a romantic relationship, and I guess often those women were his muses also. And so you can really feel in every opera is a lot about, of course, conflict and everything, but there's always love somehow. But I think even the experience of a concert, let's say if you come to the Dresden Music Festival and you go to one of those concerts, you will feel the connection through the music with your fellow concert listeners. And that love, I think, is undervalued, because in our societies now, it's a lot of discussion about how important is culture, how important is music, how important is classical music, how much should it be supported by all kinds of governmental or private institutions. And I think we completely, and I mean, in a big way, ignore the importance of culture as the place where we can feel love together, where we can actually feel something brings us together and makes us a community. And that is, for me, also love. So the theme has many, many facets. So far, we are out with the ticket sales for about a week now, and we can say it's a huge success. People are giving us a good run these first few days, and I think people embrace the big orchestras. They embrace the beautiful intimate concerts. We have more than 25 venues all over the city, and I really enjoy these smaller places also, because I go there and it's often magnificent how the artist works its way through the concert and makes those audience members, kind of part of his spiel, his art. And so it's really a wonderful way to experience that we as humans, we are not alone, and we can connect through music. That's really my main goal with this theme.
So before we get to Herr Wagner, I promise we will. I teach him, I study him constantly. That's a large part of why I went to Dresden the first time, was basically to live with Lohengrin. I a number of years ago did something called the Year of Living Lohengrin, where I basically traveled around wherever Lohengrin was being done, went to Piotr Bachava's and Anna Netrebko's first Lohengrin, which was in Dresden, studied it there, but we'll get to Wagner in a bit. How do you, as artistic director, once you have chosen a theme, how do you program? Do the artists come first? Does the music come first? You say, for example, that if the theme is love, and if these are some of the pieces that I'd like to hear, then you find the artist, or do you go to the artist and say, this is our theme, what might you want to play?
I find that last way you describe not very successful. As an artist also, I was asked, especially as a younger artist, I was asked often to submit programs to a certain theme. And in the end, people almost never would invite me with those programs, because my imagination as an artist is very different from the imagination of the institutions that puts on a festival or a season. And so I learned pretty early on that that's not the way it's going to work. So I think of our program as a puzzle. Think about a puzzle you're doing with your family, and you're sitting in front of this box with all these little pieces. What you want to do first, you want to do the sides. You want to do a framework that you can work with. And almost everybody who does puzzles starts with the sides, or tries to complete the, the frame first. And that has a reason, because once you have a frame, you can fill out the blanks, and you can start, okay, I need something of that, or I need something of that. And our program often starts with a big act. So let's say this year we have Siegfried as a finale concert, our own Siegfried on original instruments. I know we are talking about Wagner later, just want to mention. And we have opening night with the NHK and Fabi Luisi. The NHK Symphony has never been to Dresden. They're giving 2 concerts as a residency, very special. And then we have the Chicago Symphony, the London Symphony with Papano and Lisa Batashvili. And so Vienna Symphony, a few big orchestras. That's my frame. So once I have these concerts, and once I have discussed with everyone what they would like to play and how can we link it to this theme, and if we can link it, we take the concert, and then we build them, we spread them over, if possible, over the 4 weeks, and then we fill in. And then at some point I come to the meeting with my artistic administrators and say, we need more crossover, or we need more something shrill, or I need something very quiet. So we come up with Avopert, with this beautiful choral work in the church. but in the church on the side of the river where the young people live. So I want the young people to hear Avopet or something like this. Or we need more chamber music, or we need something. And then slowly we work ourselves to fill the puzzle, to give the visitor of the festival, the audience, because I do this all for the audience and not for the musicians, the audience, an overview of what this theme could express. And then when you're successful, the customers will tell you in the first few days, oh, I don't know what to choose. There's so many things I love. I want to hear the Verdi Requiem, which is, I mean, also just an incredible work. Or I want to hear the combination concert of Israel Philharmonic with the Munich Philharmonic together with Mahler, yeah? Or, I mean, there's so many different attractions, but all express the same theme. And what I tell the customers is always, just don't worry. Choose something with your heart, what you like to hear, and it will be very wonderful, and you will be content after the concerts. And don't have any FOMO, no fear of missing out, because in the end, that's not what a festival is about. It's making you an offer, and it's almost like Coney Island. You know, you go there and you don't have to have every ride on the whole Coney Island. One of my daughters used to love Coney Island, and she asked for every birthday. She said, "Can we please go to Coney Island?" Well, yeah, once we were at Coney Island, we would have maybe a couple of suites at these, you know, or a couple of extravaganzas, or then we would go on maybe 2 rides, but that's it. And the trip itself is everything. So we're making this huge offering of 65 shows to people to choose actually maybe 5 of them and be content with them.
This people will be able to find the music festival online. You'll tell me after or now, if you wish, the website where they will look. But it's a wonderful offering. I was reading through it earlier today. But I do want to single out one artist who we don't think of her as classical, but who I absolutely adore, is named Marisa.
Oh, yeah.
And there are, you know, certain people in the world like Cher, Madonna, who go by one name, and so does Marisa. And Marisa is the queen of Fado. Now, it's spelled F-A-D-O, but in Portugal, it's pronounced Fado. And this is not exactly, it is love music completely, but it's infused with something called saudade, S-A-U-D-A-D-E, which is in German would be Sehnsucht, and we don't have the right word in English. It doesn't quite cover it. A nostalgic longing, but that's not enough. It's in the extreme, and it's very beautiful because of that. And her voice is gorgeous. Her singing is gorgeous. I don't speak Portuguese, but I feel I know everything she's singing about all the time because she's so expressive. Was she in the frame or in the middle of the puzzle?
She was definitely in the frame. I adore Marisa just like you do. And yeah, you can find our program on www.musikfestspiele.com. Musik in German spelling M-U-S-I-K, festspiele.com. And I think that website, you will find lots of things. But coming back to Marisa, Marisa is a miracle, because when she's on the stage, and when she came first to the festival a few years ago, she was on the stage, and I met her before briefly, but really the first time. And then when she was on the stage, I was in the audience. I thought, oh, what a queen she is. Like, she stands there and she seems like, you know, 7 feet tall, and she seems like dominating the room, that you almost don't dare to kind of clap afterwards, because she has such an authority over the audience. A little bit like Anne-Sophie Mutter in a way. Anne-Sophie Mutter is also a queen on the stage, and kind of you have that aristocratic feeling of someone who you have to, you know, pay tribute to, rather than saying, okay, I'm here, I paid my ticket, give me a good show. You know, it's more like, oh, thank you for that I can be here and that I may be in the room with you. And so Marisa, after the show, she said, oh, then after the show, let's go out to have a drink together. And I said, sure, I'll pick you up at the hotel. She wanted to change. And then I looked in the lobby, I couldn't see her. And I looked, and finally I saw this very, very beautiful lady sitting there in a chair. and I realized that's Marisa. So
Mhm.
she had a totally different aura. And we decided this year, when you look at our program, we decided to print one of the pictures that look more like that lady I met after the concert.
Hmm.
The younger who was born in the port of Lisbon and grew up in not very privileged in a not very privileged family, as far as I know. At least she gave me this feeling of a very natural, down to earth person afterwards when we went out. And she has all these very beautiful, colorful tattoos on her arms. And she's really a totally different person from this queen I had when she was on stage. And I really thought both sides are so fascinating. And I think perhaps she can only sing so well about these stories because she experienced things that were very real, and she had a real life before she became this incredibly sophisticated artist, and carrying the stories, perhaps that's all my theory, from her childhood into this extremely sophisticated art. And therefore she is the queen of fado and will always be, I think, because she has both. She has the feet on the floor, and at the same time she is this kind of extremely gifted and extremely um, aristocratic voice of fado, which has made fado perhaps a much bigger deal in the world than it used to be
Yeah.
before Marisa.
So I'm thinking in my head, which is where I think about other singers, all women, who somehow bring their life experience and embody their country's culture. I'm not saying the life experience is the same, but if you like Edith Piaf in French music, or Mina in Italian music, or Libertad Lamarque in Argentine music, and I would love to pronounce her name correctly. I think it's Kulthum, who was the great Egyptian singer.
Right.
There are these women who just seem to be their country. I don't think
Right.
there's an American who we could define that way because America is so diverse. But maybe
Maybe
Celine
Taylor
Dion from
Swift.
Canada.
Maybe Taylor Swift is very American in a way, because she has this kind of also down to earth and everybody's neighbor kind of. She's
Yeah,
the
but
next door
this is
neighbor
not a
in the same
criticism of her.
family.
She's too young and she's too successful. Um,
Okay, okay. Okay, you had limits, but
I
I would say
mean,
Maria Callas.
sooner
Maria Callas,
Janis Joplin in a way, but not
yeah,
quite. Janis
sure.
Joplin's
Janis
very
Joplin,
eloquent,
sure. But in for Italy, I think about Maria Callas, similar story. Uh,
except she was a New Yorker.
she was a New
She
Yorker.
grew up
So
not
Maria,
far from where you live when you live in New York.
so let's count Maria Callas as a New Yorker then. So we have
Okay.
one.
Well,
So
then there we go. That is the classic American singer
exactly.
in her troubled childhood and all. There we
Yeah.
go. Okay, very
Yeah.
good. Um,
Billie Holiday. My favorite one is Billie Holiday.
yes, that would actually be a
That's
wonderful.
my favorite singer, American singer from the
Yeah, I
past.
think that given the group that we're describing would be the best example. You're right.
Oh my God,
More than Janis
she
Joplin.
was a genius. Yeah.
Um, now let's get to Herr Wagner. Richard
Okay.
Wagner was born in Leipzig, which is the other great, let's call it, Saxon city, although there are many. And Leipzig is where Bach is buried, where he did a lot of his work in the St. Thomas Church. Schumann, Brahms, Edvard Grieg, many people passed through there to study, to learn. Leipzig has great music publishing as part of its heritage, as opposed to publishing of books, music publishing. And I don't know if there's a rivalry between the two cities or whether they're two great Saxon cities of art and culture. But Wagner, as a young man, his father died. We forget that there was a big war in Europe, all over Europe, in the 1810s and a little later. And Wagner's father died in one of these massive battles where something like 75,000 people were killed. And Wagner's mother was left with the children and moved to Dresden when he was a baby. And he grew up mostly in Dresden. So technically born in Leipzig, but really a Dresdner for all intents and purposes, and was shaped by that city and by the musical sound and by everything around him, by the nature. I would think, by the physical nature of the surrounding areas. And his imprint there was great. He was a revolutionary, political revolutionary, and I believe it was May of 1849, you correct me, in which there was a rebellion, and he had to flee town, and he wound up in Switzerland. Then he wrote um, Lohengrin, but he never got to hear it. His future father-in-law, Franz Liszt, staged it in Weimar, but Wagner didn't go to that. He first heard it in Switzerland, where he lived. And therefore, Wagner carried with him his formation from Dresden, but most of his adult life was not spent in Dresden. So, how does Dresden think of him?
Well, I think the interesting part is that there's still a lot of things we can do to discover Wagner to the real core. And I think Dresden is for sure Wagner city, because you hear his operas not only here, but also, if you think about it, he was music director here also at the Staatskapelle in between, before he became a revolutionary and after he went to the Kreuzschule, which is the gymnasium, basically the school where the famous Kreuzchor, the choir, is also. He didn't sing in the choir, but he went to that particular school, and later was really famous here for being the music director, and he called the orchestra, which is still the Staatskapelle, which is still like a name, the Wunderharfe, so the wonder harp. So there is I would argue there's a stronger connection with Wagner than with any other composer, because Wagner became so big. Why does Wagner's music travel throughout the world? I'm a little bit like you. When I was a child and my father took me to Meistersinger, I really found it dreadful. Dreadful. And even as a young adult, I really had some trouble with Wagner. I played most of the operas here at the Semper Oper as a young principal cellist of the orchestra, but really only fell for Parsifal and Tristan. The Flying Dutchman didn't do anything for me, and others. But particularly, I think traveling throughout the world, I noticed from Asia to America the fascination with Wagner's work. And I think I've noticed that the mythology, especially with the Ring of the Nibelung, his biggest work, that it has a fascination crossing all generations, any culture, whether you're in India or in Russia or in Japan or in America or in Latin America, England, France, Czech Republic, Italy, everywhere there is an incredible fascination with Wagner. And therefore, when Kent Nagano came to me and said to me, he is attempting to do the whole ring on original instruments with an army of musicologists trying to find out how the hell did this sound back then, and are we on a wrong track playing with these very loud orchestras, with the singers having this huge vibrato, so you can't really understand the words often anymore? Is this maybe the wrong track? And so I thought, this is fascinating. This is something belongs to Dresden. This is something we can develop in Dresden, because it is here. There is some authentic story with Wagner being connected to the city and having been, that he was music director here. That's not a small fact.
Yeah.
So I think, therefore, when we started this project, I didn't believe it would go as far as it did. We have now played 2 operas like Rheingold and Walküre, completed them on original instruments. Whatever our instruments are not available anymore, we rebuilt them, and the sound was very different. The musicologists told us that the operas have to be very free, that Wagner liked to hear every word and rather liked his singers to speak in a theatrical way, if they have a choice between being not clear or not transparent. And he will always cut down the orchestra when the singers couldn't be heard. So a lot of things which we don't practice anymore came out during this project. And the success surprised me. Lots of papers wrote our press. We have like about 400, 500 pages of press articles about this. And at the same time, I think that's something good for Dresden, because I think all this research we are doing, someone in the world would have done it anyway in a few years. Someone would have said, oh, let's do what Nicolas Harnoncourt did to the 18th century. Let's do this with the 19th century. Let's find out what the Romantic era really sounded like. Weber, Wagner, Schumann. And so far, those three composers are all three connected to Dresden. And I think this idea of finding out how this era could have sounded is extremely fascinating. And as I said, the success surprised me. All our performances were sold out. But the biggest thanks go really to the musicologists, because what they found out and how they did research about the past, but also about the future. So we had musicologists like Kai Müller, who of course did all the basic work with all the singers and everyone. But we had also Friederike Wissmann, who would work on Walküre about the women and the philosophy of the women's roles in these operas. And it turns out, when you really do the research, yes, there's also all very strong women, and they dominate Wotan, the king of the gods, and they are much stronger than Wotan, but Wotan still calls the shots in the end. So Wagner was still a very conservative man in that respect, that yes, the women have a huge influence, and they also bring Wotan in all the difficulties. They kind of pull all the strings, but in the end, Wotan decides. And so it's very, very interesting to analyze those things. We are coming up with Siegfried. We are going to face also, we want to do research on anti-Semitism. We want to find out what, of course, we want to be transparent. We want to find out how did anti-Semitism play into the music scene of the 19th century in Central Europe? How did it play into Wagner's work in his life?
And the character of Mime in Siegfried.
The character of Mime in Siegfried, and the idea of Siegfried as a hero. So I think it's something that was overdue somehow. My great friend Kent Nagano had the idea, and he did a fabulous work with this. And I think Kent is a bit of he's a surfer. He grew up in California surfing, and he told me many stories about his encounters with great white sharks and all kinds of things, or when he swam out too far in the ocean, had to swim back like 1.5 miles or more, and just about made it. And I think here he had worked with Bernstein, he had worked with Dutilleux, and with great composers, and now he comes like with a scientific approach and maybe even a little bit of distance to discover what Wagner maybe intended. And I think that's so correct, that we're doing this with Kent, and that we're doing this with this European orchestra, the Dresdner Festspiele Orchestra, and some musicians of Concerto Köln. So we have freelancers from all over Europe who are experts on performance practice on this journey with us. And I'm so excited, because I feel most of the money we are spending on these musicians who are from days and days and weeks to rehearse in Dresden and learn or relearn these operas from a different perspective, and the singers, and even with Götterdämmerung will be a choir. So we really work with a large group of fantastic artists and fantastic musicologists, and I hope that we can do something that really revolutionizes the perception of that music, and also perhaps of Wagner's intentions here, musical intentions of when he composed that enigmatic and super famous work.
Give me some examples, if you would, of original instruments or period instruments that we may not think of that appeared in Wagner's orchestras for the ring cycle specifically.
Well, he has a few instruments, of course, as we know, Wagner invented, and the Wagner tubas, for example. Those give a very special sound. And we found really a couple of original ones in Weimar at the Hochschule. Right after when the wall came down, somebody saved 2 of them, so we could rebuild the others. And he had a special bassoon that was able to play lower than other bassoons, and that usually is not used in modern orchestras. And then all the string instruments would play gut strings. The clarinet, the oboe, has developed dramatically between 1850 and 1950. And we are going back to 1850. So it's a much simpler instrument with usually less sophistication in terms of mechanics. And the same thing goes for the horns. And there are vents, but maybe not as many. And so we really go back to a time when the wind instruments were less developed and when the string instruments were all strung up with gut strings. And we hear a little bit, it's interesting, we hear a little bit of the sound. There's a short video, I don't know if you've ever seen it, with Tannhäuser, with Fritz Busch and the Dresden Staatskapelle in the 1930s. Oh. And it's out of the overture, and you hear this incredible, dark, warm sound. And in the 30s, the Staatskapelle still played gut strings. So it's very logical that what we are rebuilding now, the sound we are rebuilding, is more similar to that sound. And this very brilliant modern Wagner sound can be, in comparison, I find, less personal. When I heard I was not involved musically, so Kent conducted, the orchestra played. In this case, I was really just an enabler as an intendant to bring this project to life. But when I listened to Walküre, I must say I was completely taken by the story, and I was carried through the opera in a way, in a theatrical way that I never felt I was before, because you understand every word. If the orchestra is a little bit more transparent, the singers use less vibrato. We have actually trainers for musicologists who work on language in the 19th century. So they try to correct the singers to speak those words correctly. And then if we give everybody a sense of purpose, this year with Friederike Wissmann talking about the role of the women in Walküre, so everybody has a sense of purpose. Okay, what does Fricka mean when she talks to Wotan? What does she intend? What was her real rights in that time, actually? So we can learn so much, and in the end, these performances are extremely inspired, and we are looking forward to going further with it, and also with the Wagner Academy, which we have founded, to frame the scientific work and do this all year round thing, to give the musicologists a possibility to publish and to participate worldwide, and to maybe help us to find a way to bring these works, which have such a large fascination to so many people, into the future, maybe in a more transparent way in every sense. And I mean research on dark sides of Wagner, like Picasso. We talk often about Picasso, and we know that Picasso was an absolute genius and fantastic painter, but by today's standards, he was, I would say, a chauvinist is probably the right word.
Yeah,
women, and he was definitely not a person that gave the partners he had the rights they deserve. So I think will discover in the future, we'll discover many biographies of great artists, of many personalities of the past, where I think the only way to approach them is transparency, to see, can we sort out how was their impact on, let's say, the craft or art they worked at, and at the same time also bring transparency into their character and their doings at that time.
So I've been to 48 complete cycles, the Ring cycle. I've taught the Ring all over the world. I still have a lot to learn. But in thinking about the fact that you have Siegfried as this year's opera in 2025 in June, if Das Rheingold it sets the table for the whole thing, and we learn who the characters are and some of the relationships, and then Die Walküre introduces more characters, two of whom produce Siegfried, who's the hero of the third opera, but we also learn a lot more about Brunhilde, and Sieglinde is her sister, half-sister, and Sieglinde, I'm not going to spoil this, but Sieglinde has some music that comes back and goes to Dameron. Siegfried is a largely male opera because Brunhilde has gone to sleep, and she will be awakened by a hero with a kiss, with the most gorgeous music of sunlight penetrating her eyes after sleeping for 18 years. Um, James Levine, with whom I was very fortunate to work with when we were doing the production of The Ring at the Met, said to me that his favorite opera to conduct was Siegfried. He said because it's the happy opera, and that Rheingold has problems, Valkyria has big problems, and Götterdämmerung has big problems for the characters. But Siegfried, mostly, unless you're a dragon, is a or Mima or a bear, is a happy opera. And it ends with one of the greatest love duets in all of opera. So is this a happy coincidence that the love opera of The Ring is being done in the year when you have love as your theme for the festival?
I like to think it's a little bit of planning too.
Okay.
but we can also call it some luck because we ended up where we wanted to be. And I think in the end, I think Siegfried, you're right. I mean, the fact that Siegfried was the son of Sieglinde and Siegmund, who were brother and sister, and that almost Sieglinde was killed in Valkyrie because Wotan wanted to kill her, but she was protected and could flee, and then Siegfried was born, and therefore you're right. Siegfried is largely a happy opera, and there's hope. Something in that ring, why it might fascinate people so much, is it's a cycle, but the cycle actually, it's when it closes, as we know in Götterdämmerung, on a depressed note, the gold goes back to the river. So actually the whole thing could start again. So it's a bit the story of humanity. And for me, I understood always the ring, like there's always a new chance to try again. And when we listen to Siegfried, there's a chance that really something good could actually happen to humanity. In Götterdämmerung, as we all know, those hopes were all doomed, and we end up in the darkest possible scenario. But we also get, again, a glimpse of hope in the end of Götterdämmerung, that the whole cycle could start again, and maybe perhaps next time people would watch out more that the gold and the ring cannot spoil all the human relationships and destroy all love. And that I think, for me, this hope is the subject also of Siegfried, and it's also of the whole ring, because I think, let's talk about something very actual. We are seeing a time in where it seems that negative forces have almost a better chance to dominate our time than positive and progressive forces. That's just my interpretation, but I'm not afraid to say it. And I think in these times, you wonder sometimes, yes, there's a lot of always pulling between, negative forces and positive things, love and hate, and all kinds of things in between. But in the end, I think hope is the most important thing, because with hope, we can wish for a time when things might be okay again. And we all remember from sometimes in our life, we remember something that was okay. Something most of humans have experienced, something in their life where they say, that was wonderful. I wish to live like that. But the reality is we all go through difficult times, and in the end, those moments become or stay as moments in our life. And hope is our only thing why we don't, let's say, why we don't give up, is hope, because hope gives us that feeling of it's possible to do it again. It's possible to have wonderful time again, and it's possible that things which seem unlikely might still be possible.
So in Turandot, the three riddles, the answers are blood, hope, and Turandot herself. So Puccini got that too. But the question I'm about to ask you sounds like I'm being clever, and I'm trying not to be clever, but it's a very serious question. The fact that in 2026 you will do the Twilight of the Gods, Götterdämmerung, the fact that right now our world at the very end of 2024 is not in good shape. There are wars everywhere. There are governments being taken over through election or through not election that don't promise humanity, that don't promise fairness and kindness. People are dying on all sides due to environmental disaster. People are trying to migrate from one part of the world to another, not sometimes to avoid political persecution, but just as often because of hunger, because of climate change, because of lack of water. Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, in a way, if you interpret it that way, expresses the destruction of the earth or a large part of it. And then, and here's the giveaway, Wagner has the choice of what music to end the cycle on. And for much of the cycle, it's about power versus love. We discover love in different characters, but most especially in Sieglinde, who sings, I'm forgetting the German right now, but Holdes Wunder, the great wonder of what is love. And that's the music that comes back at the very end of Götterdämmerung, after everybody presumably has died, except maybe the Rhine maidens. And the Rhine has flooded, the fires of Valhalla is burning and being put out. And basically it's an erasure. But then the seeds are planted, and Wagner tells us it's with love. So that's more a statement than a question. But given the state of the world, and given that Götterdämmerung for many people represents destruction rather than resurrection or revival, how do you think people are going to take that opera when it comes in 2026 in Dresden?
Well, this is actually, it is a fantastic question. And it's something that I feel is really valid. I mean, Kent Nagano has told me a long time ago, he said, we have to take this whole ring to Washington in 2027 or 2028 because of what's coming. And he's a very smart man. He knew what was coming. And I think if we think about our time, I would like to say something rather positive, to say, I feel about humanity is that my feeling about humanity is we do move forward. I do think we are able to just about always save our own planet or ourselves, just last minute always, because we have also so many negative forces in us that bring us to the absolute, limit of what humanity or our planet can take. But I do feel if you compare our time to any other time in the past, it is still, as depressing as it seems, for sure not worse, most likely better. It's hard to believe, and it doesn't mean we should have a lot of empathy for all the people who are suffering in the world. But think about the 20th century, and we are now in 24. So 1924, there was already a First World War, a Russian Revolution, and a bloodbath all over Europe that is incomparable. And chemical weapons were used in Berlin. Beginning of the 1920s, then it was the recession, the inflation, I don't know how to name it. Lots of people who had lost limbs from the war were walking around the streets. And if you think about it, I think we do progress, but very slowly. And it's the famous idea about 1 step forwards, 2 step backs, or maybe 2 steps forwards and 1 3/4 steps back. So, and that's hard. I mean, we had times when we had so much hope. For me, was the time when I would say 2010, 2012. There was times when we had so much hope and many good signs in the world. Or right after the wall came down. Let's come back to the beginning of the story. I was in East Germany. Suddenly the wall comes down, and the West and the East hug each other and say, let's make peace. And it seems the Cold War is over, and humanity could think, oh, now everything is solved. Big mistake. Of course not. Aggression is still there. Humans are humans, but we moved to darker times again. The 90s were pretty sweet, actually, in many ways, at least in Europe and also in America. late 90s, early 2000s. Well, some things like September 11th, which was horrible, but we had always recovery and we had hope again. And I think in general, I believe, to end this on a positive note, I believe we are moving forward with humanity. Even if it seems sometimes that our steps back are so big and so large that we step further back than we have gone forward, I don't believe so. So it's just, I think, something I learned over the course of my life, even with cello playing. You know, when I make a huge leap forward, and then I still, you know, I play the Dvorak concerto the 240th time, and suddenly I discover also new problems, not only new wonderful things, also new problems. And in the end, I do believe that I slowly move forward and become a better cellist, but it is not without backlash and without, you know, taking a step back and learning, oh, actually it wasn't that easy, right? So about humanity, I feel it's almost like an art. We will in the end progress, but it's a painful progression, and it takes all of our engagement. And I perhaps think that's the lesson we have to learn, that we have to engage, whether it's an art, which for sure helps humanity to feel its value and a positive energy, and or whether it's in society, in community, to take responsibilities. I think we can do this in so many ways, but I think the wonderful thing we have, you and me, is the art to live in, and so much passion and so much inspiration all the time. And I wish that I can share it with as many people in the world as possible.
I love the music of many composers, not just in the classical field, many styles of music. It's what I turn to for my solace, for my
Yes,
relaxation, but not relaxation to space out, but
right,
to refocus
right,
away from the literal to something else.
right.
But my hero among composers, I'm not saying he's the best composer, magnificent though he was, but as a man was Giuseppe Verdi.
Yeah.
And I think about him a lot, actually, because he had so much adversity in his life and nonetheless always picked himself up in the face of that and redoubled his efforts through music, but also as a citizen. Wagner built theaters for himself. Verdi built hospitals and places for old musicians to live for other people. Um, and when Verdi died, he could have been buried in Santa Croce in Florence, where it's like the pantheon of Italians. There are Michelangelo and Rossini and Machiavelli and Galileo there. Or he could have been buried in the monumental cemetery in Milan, where he briefly was buried. But he was buried in the rest home, in the retirement home of musicians in Milan. And the simple words on above his tomb are pianse e amò per tutti. In other words, he wept and he loved for us all. And the words are by D'Annunzio, who politically is my complete polar opposite, but he was a good writer. And he understood that Verdi wept for us all so that he could love us all. And by going deep to the tragic side, he was able to bring the love part, and that ultimately he acted from a default position of love, but underpinned by the greatest humanity. I won't say other composers don't have humanity, obviously they do, but there's just something about that man and the way he connected his creativity and his sense of political and global commitment. He was not necessarily religious, but he was not anti-religion. But he found in a more secular way the ability to love as a means of making his society better. And so I know you're doing the Verdi Requiem this year as one of the choices. Um, I think of him all the time. I hope that somebody will be there in Dresden to talk about him. I can't come. I promised I would come if I could, but I cannot come.
Yeah.
But because in that particular piece, he expressed his love for the writer Manzoni. And you could call it a religious piece, you could call it a secular piece. It's all of that. But it's ultimately about Libera me, set me free. And that comes with unconditional love. And I think that that's what that piece expresses.
That's so true. No, I love that piece. And Verdi's music, I think, is among the greatest of all. I agree. Beethoven, Mozart, you name it. I would like to name Schumann, and yeah, Verdi's operas are just at the very top of their art. Yeah, and we love the Requiem, and it's always a big operation. You need a big choir and soloists, and we're doing it on original instruments with our festival orchestra. So it's a big operation, but we want to show it actually in the context of our Wagner project, to show the contemporaries, the great contemporaries, what they did at the same time when Wagner composed his opera. So it's a series called Wagner Plus, because we want to show here great composers, also Jewish composers like Mendelssohn, later Mahler, and put them in perspective with Wagner's work. So it's for us, it's actually it's very, very important to show this at the same time. The Verdi Requiem fits well in that context.
So geographically, if I'm remembering, there is the reconstructed synagogue in Dresden. I think
Yes.
Michael Herschel is the music director.
Correct.
And it's called the New Neue Jüdische Kammerorchester, the New Jewish Chamber Orchestra.
Yeah.
Do they have any role in the festival?
Not this year, but we have often presented them and regularly present them. And we work also with Theresienstadt. We go to the switches on the way to Prague, the concentration camp where many intellectuals were jailed. And so I think it's very, very important for us to show the full picture of where anti-Semitism and music that was also biographies that were interrupted in the 20th century, and where everything fits together. And I think it's looking for, I think the main thing perhaps is to try to learn from the past. And I feel the friendship between Germany and Israel at the moment is expressing that learning curve. And my friend Omar Meyer-Welber, who is the Israeli conductor, and we work together quite a lot, he always says he hopes sometimes that maybe this respect that Germans and Israelis have for each other can be at some point maybe built between people in Gaza and Israelis. So this kind of not forgetting the past and not forgetting the tragedies of the past, which you can never forget, or perhaps even never forgive, but you can build trust on a new basis. And I think Germany and Israel have done that in the past, post-war period. And I think, but one part of it is learning from the past and its transparency. I think in order to assure that it's an honest effort and not just diplomatic, kind of prose. Yeah.
You were talking about taking 2 steps forward, 1 3/4 step back. I'm deeply troubled. I knew I was going to go into a music career, but my major in college was history, because I felt that if I were to understand the composers, the languages, the traditions, that I would have to know the history very well. And I fear that we don't teach enough history, either because it's just not considered as useful as math and science and so on. But it's, to me, fundamental. But then a lot of people won't teach history because history can be interpreted in so many ways that one man's war is another man's victory and another man's defeat. And, women's history, the history of different ethnic groups and racial groups and so on, slavery in America, massive history that is sometimes diminished and which it should not be. But I agree with you about that. But I want to conclude with something you just said, even though I intended to conclude with Wagner. You said that you would rank Schumann among the greatest composers. And I can tell you from personal experience that many of the greatest musicians I've ever spoken to have said, well, yes, Beethoven and Mozart and Verdi and Wagner. And then they say, but then there's Schumann. And Leonard Bernstein and Claudio Abbado, both of whom I knew quite well, both at the end of their lives were studying Schumann scores and not other things. What is it about Robert Schumann?
Well, I think it's something for me was instinctive. I always loved his songs. So Dichterliebe was for me something absolutely I would go to when I'm feeling a little blue. I would listen to the Dichterliebe, and there's every love song is a failure, right? I mean, the texts are basically if you listen to Dichterliebe, it's okay. Love means unhappiness. So that's the basic conclusion of the texts of this wonderful work. But there's in the music, there's this incredible overflowing beauty and unlimited imagination. And when I played the cello concerto, which I learned quite late, I was in my early 20s, and it was a piece I played often, and often it came in important moments of my career. So my debut in Berlin, when I was beginning of my 20s, I played Schumann Concerto, and later my first few big concerts in America was Schumann Concerto. My debut with the New York Philharmonic was Schumann Concerto, and so many times. But always just in awe of the incredible poetic beauty. So it's almost like a poet. He's like a poet. He has construction, which Bach has, that Beethoven has, that many great composers have, but it's more the cell. Out of the cell comes something so beautiful. The Schumann Piano Concerto starts so unconventional, and I heard it with Martha, the great Martha Argerich, one time in an ideal interpretation in Munich, where she started this little choral in the beginning quite informally, like almost like just a few chords. And then suddenly the piece wakes up, and out of the cell develops this incredible concerto. And you find suddenly you're really pushed back to your chair, and you think like, wow, where did this come from? So Schumann has a magical, maybe I would say it's an imbalance in his music. Perhaps we all have an imbalance in our systems, like maybe in our souls, something is not quite balanced with, I mean, most people, I would say 99% of the people. And so that imbalance in Schumann perhaps is so magical, because he was one moment, he was the happiest man on earth. And the next moment he was really down. And I think that's deeply human. I mean, it's maybe something we all experience those moments, and I think maybe that's perhaps so attractive in Schumann's music, how directly he can convey his mood and his state of his soul, I think, or something like that, and perhaps with so much mastery, of course. Especially the harmonies are magical. And when he heard Wagner, we have to say this because it's quite funny. He heard Lohengrin and wrote a letter to Hans von Bülow expressing how poor he thought the harmonies and basically the craftsmanship was. And it says a lot when Schumann writes this. But then he writes in the end of the letter, he says, but yet, my dear friend, you can't imagine that there's some dark fire that is so fascinating and even gripped me and got me fascinated. That this piece with all the wrong harmonies and all the composition mistakes has. So he did admit that Wagner has something, but he himself was an incredible master of harmony and cadence and structure. I mean, harmonic and melodic structure. And perhaps in that mastery, he was superior to Brahms and superior to many others. In my opinion, harmony-wise, possibly superior to Beethoven, which is a big word to say. I'm sorry, but personally superior to Beethoven. And his poetic, intimate style, that's often symphonic, but yet it's intimate, very intimate. Also that intimacy, hard to find in music history, I find. Maybe with Schubert, some of it.
That says it all. Thank you for that. No, I mean, because I knew Abbado and Bernstein quite well. I studied with both, but at the very ends of their lives, when they were basically quite ill, especially Abbado in his way, I'm always interested what musicians turn to, and
Yeah,
both of them turned to Robert Schumann, but I didn't have the chance to ask either one of them why. But
yeah.
you've just given me a very good answer, so I
It's
appreciate that.
possible.
Yeah.
Possible.
Um, and Jan Vogler, thank you for this wonderful conversation. I ask everybody to go to Dresden for the wonderful
Thank you.
festival,
Thank
and
you.
to hear you when you're performing. And I look forward to seeing you next time you're in New York. If Marisa would eat sardines with you in Lisbon, I'll have herring with you in New York. How about that?
Good deal. Sounds great, Fred.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.